Hello, my name is Maria Jolicoeur. Welcome to my show, Let's Talk About History. I'm going to be talking today about colonial fabric and clothing. And since April Fool's Day is coming up on April 1st, I'm going to talk about the history of April Fool's Day. Colonial clothing. This article was taken from Colonial Clothing webpage. This article on the colonial clothing describes the beliefs and the religion of the Puritans. Items of colonial clothing for men, women, and children. The colors of colonial clothing and the symbolic and religious meanings of the colors worn by Puritans. Materials and dyes used to make colonial clothing and sumptuary laws. Colonial clothing reflected the beliefs and religions of the early colonists, the Puritans. The Puritans wanted the Church of England to become pure by getting rid of the Catholic practices. They hated elaborately decorated churches and statues and shrines. Puritans believed in total simplicity, that everything should be plain. And these basic beliefs also encompass their Puritan colonial clothing. Colonial clothing in the age of excess. The early colonial clothing in the Puritan style was totally different in the types of clothes favored by other people who lived in England. The English clothes were highly elaborate. Velvet, satins, and silks were favored by the wealthy. Frills, lace, buttons, and bows decorated their clothing. Fancy buckles, buttons, fans, even handkerchiefs were highly decorated. Feathered hats, bright colors, shoes, and heels, low necklines for women were in fashion. Admittedly, only the wealthy and the nobility wore these expensive clothes, but they were seen as the Puritans as a profligate society. The elaborate robes worn by Catholic priests. Ellen, something's going on in the back. You have something on. Catholic priests were viewed with disgust by the men and women who adhered to the Puritan religion and adopted their own style of colonial clothing. The plain and simple colonial clothing was a public expression of the beliefs of the Puritans, which encompassed the notion of simplicity. Puritans practiced strictness and austerity in their religion, lifestyle, and conduct. The colonial clothing worn by Puritan men and women reflected their belief in austerity. Puritans were strongly opposed to sensual pleasures and were strong advocates of propriety, modesty, and decorum. Once again, the early colonial clothing of the Puritans reflected these beliefs. Colonial clothing for men. The colonial clothing worn by Puritan men were quite heavy and made from materials such as wool, linen, or leather. The items of colonial clothing worn by Puritan men included the following: long length loose linen shirts, breeches, which were short length pants that were fastened to the knee, socks, long woolen socks were worn, a jerkin, which was a sleeveless jacket which could be made of cloth or leather, a doublet, which was a padded jacket with sleeves. Belts were sometimes worn, plain leather shoes, usually without buckles, hats, often quite large in a variety of style, usually wide brims. Coats or capes were worn as protection from the cold and the rain. Colonial clothing for women. The colonial clothing worn by Puritan women were also quite heavy and made from materials such as wool and linen. The items of colonial clothing worn by Puritan women included the following: long length blue shift, which was worn as an undergarment. The sleeves were sometimes removable and should be tied on. The shift was covered by petticoats. Long gowns or shirts with a jacket were worn as the outer clothing. Belts were sometimes worn, socks, long woolen stockings, plain leather shoes. All clothes were held in place by tying them with laces. An apron was usually worn over the woman's clothes. The women wore their hair long, but it would have been deemed unseemly for hair to be shown. Hair was therefore hidden under a close-fitting coif. Coats or capes were worn as protection from the cold and the rain. So this is a picture of that's a colonial clothing lady right there. Colonial clothing for children. The clothing for very young children, both girls and boys, were simple shifts. The colonial clothing worn by children of the age of 7 were similar in style to those worn by adults. The items of colonial clothing worn by children, therefore, consisted of similar versions of the clothes worn by Puritan men and women. Colonial clothing for servants. The colonial clothing for servants clung to the old traditional color of blue clothing as it had been for many years in England. The dye to produce the color blue in England, woad, was cheap, and color blue was always associated with servitude. Colonial clothing sumptuary laws. English sumptuary laws had long dictated what colors and types of clothing individuals were allowed to own and wear. An easy and immediate way to identify rank and privilege. The sumptuary laws maintained class distinctions, but also impressed luxury and discouraged extravagance, especially among the lower classes. The laws regulated ostentatious expenditure on dress and ornaments. Many of the sumptuary laws that governed much of the dress worn in England were repealed in 1603 by King James I. The repeal of the sumptuary laws in England was a bad decision from the Puritan point of view and led to excess in apparel, the complete opposite of the view on Puritan colonial clothing. Colonial clothing sumptuary laws introduced to America. When the New England colonies were becoming established, the Puritans introduced sumptuary laws specifying rules for colonial clothing in America. In 1651, both the magistrates and deputies of Massachusetts agreed on the following piece of legislation which included the following: declare our utter detestation and dislike that men or women of mean condition, educations, and callings should take upon them the garb of gentlemen by the wearing of gold or silver lace or buttons or point at their knees to walk in great boots, or women of the same rank to wear Tiffany hoods or scarves, which, though allowable to persons of greater estate or more liberal education, yet we cannot but judge it intolerable in persons of such like condition. The Puritans' views on the wearing of simple Puritan clothes were enforced by law in the American colonies, therefore declaring the styles of colonial clothing. Colonial clothing, the meaning of colors. The colors of the colonial clothing of the Puritans were somber. The range of colors used in Puritan colonial clothing included russet, a reddish-brown color, black, gray, brown, green, dull pale yellow, and blue. Accessories such as collars, cuffs, aprons, and handkerchiefs were usually white. The symbolic meaning of the color, which was purity and virtue. There were symbolic meanings of other colors which the Puritans approved of in Puritan clothes and colonial clothing. So the actual color of the colonial clothing reflected the strong religious beliefs. Black colonial clothing symbolized humility and plainness and could be cheaply produced by using coarse, rough, undyed dark wool. The color blue was closely associated with servitude. It was a popular color of colonial clothing worn by servants. Woad was a source of cheap blue dye. The biblical meaning of blue symbolized heavenly grace. Cheap dyes made from the madder root produced red-based colors, including orange, russet, and brown. The symbolic meaning of the color orange and russet was a symbol of courage. The meaning of the color brown was humility and poverty. Cheap dyes were used to produce colonial clothing in the color gray. The meaning of the color gray was repentance. Gray is also associated with Lent and therefore closely associated with fasting and prayer. Cheap dyes were also used to produce the color green, usually from lichen and vegetable dyes. The meaning of the color green was renewal of life and nature. Cheap dyes such as weld were used to produce a pale color yellow. The meaning of the color yellow was renewal and hope. If you look at pictures of Puritan colonial clothing, the colors they wore will all be confirmed. The additional information regarding the symbolic and religious meaning of Puritan clothes and colonial clothing provides an insight into the beliefs of the Puritans and early colonists. The Puritans were strong advocates of property, modesty, and decorum, which are all words that can be associated with colonial clothing. Colonial clothing textiles. Different types of textiles were used not only to make clothing, but also to make bedding, linens, curtains, ship sails, and upholstery. Textiles used during the colonial era were made chiefly from wool and flax. Flax was a plant that had a little yellow flower at the end of it. They would plant flax in their garden, and in the spring, in the summer, when it was full grown, they would cut the flax and they would lie the stems down on the ground and let the sun dry it. And those stems would be pulled apart from flax, and that's how they would make linen. The small um, fibers from the stem, they would weave, um, and only a certain group of people used to make linen from flax, and it was an art that they kept within their families, making linen for undergarments, scarves. Cotton was used less often by for colonial clothing. A material called serge, which was a durable twilled woolen fabric, was commonly used for bed curtains, upholstery, and clothing. Linsey woolsey or wincey was a strong, coarse fabric that was a combination of linen and wool and a popular textile for colonial clothing. During the colonial period, less than 50% of all households had spinning wheels used for spinning yarn from wool and knitting sweaters and stockings. Fewer than 10% owned looms that weaved yarn into textiles. So, April Fool's Day is coming up April 1st. So I'd like to talk about quickly the history of April Fool's Day. The contents comes from history.com. April Fool's Day, celebrated on April 1st each year, has been celebrated for several centuries by different cultures. Though its exact origins remain a mystery, April Fool's Day traditions include playing hoaxes or practical jokes on others, often yelling April Fools at the end to clue in the subject of the April Fool's Day prank. While its exact history is shrouded in mystery, the embrace of April Fool's Day jokes by the media and major brands has ensured the unofficial holiday's long life. some some historians speculate that April Fool's Day dates back to 1582, when France switched from the Julian calendar to the Gregorian calendar, as called for by the Council of Trent in 1563. In the Julian calendar, as in the Hindu calendar, the new year began with the spring equinox around April 1st. People who were slow to get the news or failed to recognize that the start of the new year had moved to January 1st and continued to celebrate it during the last week of March through April 1st became the butt of jokes and hoaxes and were called April Fools. These pranks included having paper fish placed on their backs and being referred to as Poisson d'Avril, April's fish, said to symbolize a young, easily caught fish and a gullible person. Historians have also linked April Fool's Day to festivals such as Hilaria, Latin for joyful, which was celebrated in ancient Rome at the end of March by followers of the cult of Cybele. It involved people dressing up in disguises and mocking fellow citizens and even magistrates, and was said to be inspired by the Egyptian legend of Isis, Osiris, and Seth. Vernal Equinox. There's also speculation that April Fool's Day was tied to the vernal equinox, a first day of spring in the northern hemisphere, when Mother Nature fooled people with changing, unpredictable weather. History of April Fool's Day. April Fool's Day spread throughout Britain during the 18th century in Scotland. The tradition became a 2-day event, starting with hunting the gowk, in which people were sent on phony errands. Gowk is a word for cuckoo bird, a symbol for fool, and followed by tail day, which involved pranks played on people's derrieres, such as pinning fake tails or kick me signs on them. April Fool's Day pranks. In modern times, people have gone to great lengths to create elaborate April Fool's Day hoaxes. Newspapers, radio, and TV stations and websites have participated in the April 1st tradition of reporting outrageous fictional claims that have fooled their audiences. In 1957, the BBC reported that Swiss farmers were experienced a record spaghetti crop and showed footage of people harvesting noodles from trees. In 1985, Sports Illustrated writer George Plimpton tricked many readers when he ran a made-up article about a rookie pitcher named Sid Finch, who could throw a fastball over 168 miles per hour. In 1992, National Public Radio ran a spot with former President Richard Nixon saying he was running for president again. Only it was an actor, not Nixon, and the segment was all an April Fool's Day prank. It was in that caught the country by surprise. In 1996, Taco Bell, the fast food restaurant chain, duped people. When it announced it had agreed to purchase Philadelphia's Liberty Bell and intended to rename it the Taco Liberty Bell. In 1998, after Burger King advertised a left-handed Whopper, scores of clueless customers requested the fake sandwich. Google notoriously hosts an annual April Fool's Day prank that has included everything from telepathic search to the ability to play Pac-Man on Google Maps. For the average trickster, there is always the classic April Fool's Day prank of covering the toilet with plastic wrap or switching out sugar and salt. So, article, some of the sources was Washington Post, National Geographic, CNN, and CBS. So, I hope you enjoyed my show.